He came to the mountains to outrun memories. But the mountains have a memory of their own, long and patient. For Elias Thorne, a man in his 40s who moved with the quiet economy of a predator at rest, the high country of northern Idaho was supposed to be a sanctuary of forgetting. He sought the kind of silence that was so total it could swallow the past, the echoes of orders given and not given, of a life lived on the razor's edge in places the world preferred to ignore. But his companion, a veteran of a different sort, refused to forget. Gage, his German shepherd, whose muzzle was turning a dignified gray, froze on the path one morning, his body a rigid line of descent. The dog's instinct, honed in the same unforgiving landscapes that had scarred his master, had found something wrong in the world. It was a secret buried for over 60 years, a story of promises broken and lives lost, sleeping beneath a collapsed bridge. And now, it was awake. What do you do when the one thing you trust most in the world tells you to stop running and face a ghost that isn't even your own? Where are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments. Like and subscribe, and let this story of loyalty and long-buried truth unfold. The air in the high Latah Valley was thin and sharp, tasting of pine resin and the coming frost. It was a clean taste, an honest one, and Elias Thorne drew it deep into his lungs. It was a poor substitute for absolution, but it was something. He stood on a granite outcrop overlooking a sweep of timber that fell away into a deep, shadowed ravine. The sun was a pale coin in the east, not yet strong enough to burn away the chill that had settled in the stones overnight. He wore his uniform of self-imposed exile, a faded olive field jacket over a worn plaid flannel shirt, cargo pants, and leather boots that had molded to his feet over 1,000 miles of penance. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked with relentless precision, each second a quiet accusation. Beside him, Gage sat, his posture not of a pet awaiting a command, but of a partner assessing a tactical situation. The dog was older now, the powerful muscles of his youth tempered into a lean, enduring strength. He had been with Elias for 9 years, from the dust of Kandahar to this quiet, green wilderness. Gage's presence was a constant, a physical anchor to the present. His breathing was a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the anxious thrumming in Elias's own chest, a sound that had grounded him through more long nights than he could count. The dog's amber eyes scanned the same vista as Elias, but he saw more. He always saw more. They had a routine, a liturgy of movement and silence. Dawn, coffee boiled over a single-burner stove, a methodical check of their gear packed into the Eberlestock half-track on Elias's back. Then they would walk. They walked until the physical exhaustion began to quiet the noise in his head. The looping reel of a sun-scorched ridge in the Hindu Kush. The static crackle of a radio. The weight of a choice that had cost a good man his life. He had been the one to make the call. Mission over man. It was the correct tactical decision. It was the one that had broken him. He had come here, to this plot of land inherited from a grandfather he barely knew, to build a wall of silence and solitude around that memory. He spoke to no one but Gage, and even then, his words were sparse, functional. Water. Stay. Watch. The dog understood the words, but he responded to the man, to the tension in his shoulders, the deep-set weariness in his eyes, the way he would sometimes stop and stare at nothing, his hand unconsciously checking the folding knife clipped to his pocket. This morning was different. The air felt heavier, charged with a stillness that was not peaceful, but expectant. The mountain held its breath. Elias felt it as a prickle on his skin, a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure. He glanced at Gage. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. A low, almost inaudible rumble vibrated through the soles of Elias's boots, coming not from Gage's chest, but from the earth itself. It was the sound of something deep and ancient and disturbed. Gage shifted his weight, a silent communication Elias had learned to read with absolute trust. The dog was not merely alert, he was troubled. His gaze was fixed on a specific point far down the trail where an old, decommissioned railway line crossed the deep ravine. Or rather, where it once had. The bridge had collapsed decades ago, its iron bones now a tangle of rust and ruin at the bottom of the gorge, swallowed by 60 years of forest growth. It was a landmark, a scar on the landscape they passed every day. But today, Gage saw it as something else. The dog took a half step forward, his body low to the ground. He did not bark or whine. Gage was a professional. He signaled. He did not alarm. The message was clear. There. Something is wrong there. Elias trusted that instinct more than he trusted his own eyes. It was Gage's nose that had found the IED tripwire outside Bagram. It was Gage's stillness that had warned him of the ambush in the Korengal. And it was Gage, now, telling him that this quiet place of forgetting was about to demand he remember how to pay attention. He settled his hand on the dog's neck, the coarse fur a familiar comfort. "All right, boy," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Show me." Gage moved without hesitation, not running, but trotting with a purpose that pulled Elias along in his wake. They left the high ground, descending the well-worn game trail that followed the contour of the hill. The air grew thicker, damp with the smell of decaying leaves and wet stone from the creek that ran through the bottom of the ravine. The silence here was different, heavier. It was the quiet of a place where something had ended violently. They reached the edge of the gorge. The old railway bed, a flat, grassy track carved out of the hillside, ended abruptly. Before them was a chasm, maybe 100 feet across. On the other side, the railway bed continued its straight, determined line into the trees. In the ravine below, choked with alder and devil's club, lay the skeletal remains of the bridge. Twisted iron trusses, like the ribs of a fallen leviathan, were covered in a patina of orange rust and green moss. Gage did not stop at the edge. He veered left, following the lip of the ravine for another 50 yards, his nose to the ground, his tail held low and rigid. Then he stopped. He stood over a spot where the earth seemed no different from any other patch of moss and pine needles. He looked back at Elias, a clear, insistent command in his eyes. "Here." Elias knelt, running his hand over the ground. It was soft, damp. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He trusted the dog. He unslung his pack and took out a small entrenching tool, its edge still sharp. He began to dig, carefully scraping away the layers of forest debris. The soil was dark and loamy, full of roots. He dug for 5 minutes, Gage watching with an unnerving, patient intensity. Then the shovel head struck something with a dull, metallic clank. It was not a rock. The sound was wrong. It was hollow, resonant. Elias cleared the dirt away with his hands. He uncovered a flat piece of metal, roughly 2 feet square, its surface pitted with corrosion. It was a panel of some kind, its edges flanged as if it were meant to be riveted to a larger structure. Bolted to its center was a small brass plate, tarnished nearly black with age. Elias took out his knife and carefully scraped the grime from the plate. Letters and numbers emerged from the darkness. A serial number, and below it, 3 words stamped into the brass. Pullman Car Company. Elias stared at it. A Pullman car. A passenger car. He looked from the plate in the ground to the mangled freight trusses of the bridge far below. Freight bridges carried freight trains, boxcars, flatbeds, tankers, not luxury passenger cars. Gage whined, a low, anxious sound. He nudged Elias's hand with his wet nose, then looked pointedly down into the ravine, directly below where they stood. It was the steepest part of the gorge, a near vertical wall of rock and scree thick with undergrowth. Elias understood. The panel was a piece of wreckage thrown far from the main impact. But the car itself, the car was down there, separate from the bridge, hidden. He stood up, his mind shifting gears, the old training rising through the fog of his solitude like a muscle memory. Assess, orient, decide, act. He scanned the ravine, his eyes tracing the path of least resistance. It would be a difficult descent, dangerous. The ground was unstable. But the question was now lodged in his mind, a piece of shrapnel he had to dig out. What was a Pullman passenger car doing in the middle of a freight train derailment from the 1950s? And why was it buried up here, away from the rest of the wreckage? He looked at Gage, who sat waiting, his duty done. The dog had found the anomaly. He had delivered the message. The rest was up to him. The quiet life Elias had tried to build for himself was over. The silence had been broken, not by a memory from his past, but by a question from someone else's. He pulled his leather gloves from his jacket pocket, the worn material creaking as he flexed his fingers. He had a new mission. He had to go down. The descent into the ravine was a controlled fall. Elias used the tough, wiry trunks of the alder trees as handholds, his boots finding purchase in the soft earth and loose rock. Gage scrambled alongside him, his movements more certain, his low center of gravity an advantage on the steep incline. The air grew colder as they dropped into the shadow of the gorge, the sunlight unable to penetrate the dense canopy. The smell of decay was stronger here, a mix of wet leaves and something else, something acrid and metallic, the faint, lingering ghost of rust and old oil. He paused halfway down, bracing himself against a moss-covered boulder. Below, the tangled skeleton of the bridge was a lesson in physics and failure. But his attention was not on the bridge. It was on the area directly beneath where Gage had found the panel. It was a landslide, an ancient one, a cascade of rock and soil that had poured down from the rim of the ravine. It was overgrown now, covered in the same 60-year-old foliage as the rest of the gorge, but the shape was undeniable. It was a burial mound, and it was not natural. He reached the bottom, the creek gurgling over smooth stones nearby. From this angle he could see it. Protruding from the base of the landslide, like the tip of a buried spear, was a corner of curved steel. It was painted a dark forest green, the paint flaking away to reveal the raw, oxidized metal beneath. It was the rounded observation end of a passenger car. A Pullman. Elias approached it slowly, methodically. His training took over completely now, his senses heightened, his mind cataloging details. This was a scene. It had to be read. He ran his gloved hand over the cold steel. The rivets were tight and evenly spaced. This was quality craftsmanship, built to last. It had lasted, in its own way. He followed the exposed curve of the car until he found a window. The glass was gone, shattered long ago. But the thick rubber seal was still in place, cracked and brittle. He peered inside. It was a cavern of blackness, the interior filled with decades of accumulated dirt and debris that had washed in through the broken windows. But he could make out shapes. The ghostly outline of a seat, its upholstery rotted away. The glint of chrome from a luggage rack. This was not a cargo hold. People had been in here. Gage, who had been sniffing intently at the base of the landslide, let out a soft woof. He began to dig, not frantically, but with the same deliberate purpose as before. He was focused on a spot near the rear of the car, where the steel was buckled and torn. Elias moved to his side, shining his flashlight onto the area. The metal here wasn't rusted through. It was cut. The edges were too clean, too precise. They were torch cuts, jagged and crude, but undeniably man-made. Someone had cut their way into, or out of, this car after the crash. This was the detail that shifted everything. A crash was a tragedy, an accident. But torch cuts and a deliberately buried car spoke of something else. They spoke of intention, of secrets, of survivors who did not want to be found, or a recovery crew that wanted to ensure something was never found. He followed the line of the cut. It formed a rough, man-sized rectangle, a makeshift door. The panel that had been cut out was gone. He directed his light back to the landslide. It wasn't just a random collapse. The distribution of rock and soil was too uniform. It looked like it had been pushed, perhaps with a bulldozer from the railway bed above, a quick and dirty way to make a 100-ton problem disappear. Hide the car, hide the story. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was no longer just a historical curiosity. This was a cover-up. The mountain hadn't just swallowed a train car. It had been feted. He thought of the quiet men he had worked with, men who specialized in making problems disappear, in sanitizing scenes and rewriting events in the field. The work had a certain signature, a brutal efficiency. He was looking at that signature now, 6 decades old. He had to get inside. The makeshift door was too high to climb through easily. He needed leverage. He scanned the wreckage of the bridge nearby and found what he was looking for, a long, solid piece of iron I-beam, half buried in the mud. It was heavy but manageable. He dragged it over and wedged it against the base of the car, creating a crude ramp. He gave Gage a quiet command. "Watch." The dog sat, his body oriented back towards the trail they had descended, his ears swiveling to catch the slightest sound. He was on guard. Elias holstered his flashlight, clipped a more powerful headlamp to his forehead, and pulled himself up the iron beam. He swung his legs through the jagged opening, careful to avoid the sharp edges of the cut steel. He dropped into the interior of the car. The landing was soft, a cushion of packed earth and rotted leaves. He switched on his headlamp. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the absolute darkness. The air was thick, heavy, and cold, carrying the smell of rust, mold, and time itself. The car was tilted at a severe angle, making it difficult to stand. He was in what looked like a small galley or service area at the rear of the car. Stainless steel countertops were grimy but intact. A small built-in cabinet hung open, its contents long since spilled and buried. He moved forward, his feet crunching on unseen debris. The beam of his lamp swept across the main cabin. It had been a luxury car. The seats were arranged in small private groupings. He could see the remnants of wood paneling on the walls. But the scene was one of utter devastation. Everything was broken, thrown about by the violence of the crash. Yet, even in the chaos, there were details that felt wrong. He saw a stack of empty tin cans in a corner, neatly piled. Sea rations, military issue from the era. They were opened cleanly, not torn. Nearby, a half-dozen wool blankets were folded, stiff with age and damp, but clearly placed with care. This was not just the site of a crash. This was the site of a survival. Someone had lived in this car for a time after it was buried. Then he saw the footlocker. It was a standard-issue military footlocker, tucked beneath a collapsed table as if to hide it. It was closed, its brass latches green with verdigris. This was it. This was the heart of the matter. Stories are carried in objects, and a locked chest in a buried tomb was a story waiting to be told. He knelt beside it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He ran his fingers over the stenciled lettering on the top, faded but still legible beneath the grime. It wasn't a name. It was a project designation. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Project Peregrine. Project Peregrine. The name meant nothing to him, but it felt important. It felt classified. He examined the latches. They were locked. He could force them, but his training whispered caution. Preserve, don't destroy. He made a decision. He would leave it for now. He needed context. He needed to know what Project Peregrine was and what had happened in this ravine in, he guessed, the late 1950s. To do that, he had to leave the silence of the mountains and go into the world of people and records. He had to go to town. The town of Hemlock Creek was a 10-mile drive in his old pickup. It was a place that felt preserved in amber, a handful of brick-fronted buildings huddled along a main street that had not changed much in 50 years. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was an event. Elias felt the weight of casual glances as he parked his truck, the quiet curiosity of the locals. He was an outsider, a man who kept to himself up on the old Miller place. His presence here was an anomaly, just like the Pullman car. He walked into the Latah County Clerk's office. The building smelled of old paper, floor wax, and steam heat. A tall, spare woman in her late 50s with sharp blue eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun looked up from a massive leather-bound ledger. She wore a simple dress and a cardigan, but she had the posture of a drill sergeant. This was a woman who guarded her domain with fierce diligence. "Can I help you?" Her voice was polite but carried no warmth. It was a voice that expected you to state your business clearly and without fuss. "I'm looking for records," Elias said, his own voice feeling foreign in the quiet room. "Accident reports from the old rail line north of here." She adjusted her glasses, her gaze analytical. She was taking his measure. The worn field jacket, the disciplined stillness, the faint scar on his temple. "We don't keep railroad records here. That would have been the company's business, Pacific and Western." "The company is long gone," Elias stated. "I'm interested in the bridge collapse, the one in the ravine about 15 miles north of town." "The old trestle bridge," she said, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "That was a long time ago, before my time. My father remembered it. A freight train went down, 1957, September." She spoke with the certainty of someone who dealt in facts and dates. "Was there a formal inquiry? A county report? Sheriff's logs?" "There would have been." She turned and walked to a wall of filing cabinets, her movements efficient. She pulled open a long, thin drawer marked Archival Sheriff 1950 to 1959. She ran a finger down the tabs, then stopped. She pulled out a thin file folder. "Here. Derailment, P&W line, September 14th, 1957. She handed it to him across the counter. Elias opened it. The file was disappointingly slim. A 2-page report from the sheriff at the time. It described a flash flood washing out the footings of the bridge during a severe thunderstorm. A P&W freight train, number 74, was unable to stop. The report listed the contents: lumber, machine parts, grain. It listed the crew, 2 men, engineer and brakeman. Both lost. The final sentence was stark. Recovery of wreckage deemed unfeasible due to terrain. Site secured and abandoned. There was no mention of a passenger car, no mention of survivors, no mention of the Army Corps of Engineers. The official story was neat, simple, and a lie. "Does it say what you need?" the woman asked, her eyes missing nothing. "Not exactly," Elias said carefully. He decided to take a small risk.
The report mentions a freight train.
Are you certain there were no passengers? The clerk, whose nameplate read Martha Riley, gave him a long, searching look. She was no fool. She knew he was digging for something.
The report is the report. It's what was recorded. Her tone was flat, but Elias detected a subtle shift, a hint of professional curiosity warring with her ingrained caution. I found something at the site, Elias said, lowering his voice. A piece of a Pullman car. Martha Riley's expression did not change, but her posture stiffened. She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The official record is often incomplete, she said, her voice now a conspiratorial whisper. Especially when the federal government was involved. She took the file back from him and tapped a finger on the date. 1957, the middle of the Cold War. There was a lot of activity up here. Surveying, construction, things people weren't supposed to talk about. She paused, making a decision. The sheriff's report is a dead end. But property records don't lie. She turned to a different set of massive books. The railroad owned the right-of-way, but the land around it, who owned that? And who bought it or surveyed it afterward? Her fingers, surprisingly nimble, danced across the brittle pages of an old plat book. Here, she said, her voice tight with discovery. Look at this. She pointed to a map from 1958. The rail line was a thin black line. The land on either side of the ravine was marked with a new designation, one that wasn't there in the 1956 map. It had been deeded over to the U.S. Department of the Interior with a special easement granted to the Department of the Army for geological survey purposes. The transaction was dated October 1957, 1 month after the crash. They sealed it off, Elias murmured. They hadn't just abandoned the site. They had acquired it.
They had buried the evidence and then bought the tomb. Martha Riley looked at him, her caution replaced by a grudging respect.
You're looking for something more than old train parts, aren't you?
I'm looking for the truth, Elias said.
She considered this. Truth is a heavy thing to go digging for alone, she said. There's a man you should talk to. Alastair Finch. He was a surveyor for the state back in the 70s. Now he's the closest thing we have to a town historian. He lives in the old schoolhouse on the edge of town. If anyone knows about strange geological surveys from that era, it's him. Tell him Martha sent you. And, she added, her voice dropping again, be careful. Some stories are buried for a reason. Dr. Alastair Finch was a man who seemed to be made of tweed and pipe tobacco. He was in his late 70s, with a cloud of white hair and bright, inquisitive eyes behind thick spectacles.
His home, the converted schoolhouse, was a chaotic wonderland of books, maps, and geological samples. A massive drafting table dominated the main room, covered in topographical charts of the surrounding mountains.
Martha sent you?
He chirped, ushering Elias inside.
Then the matter must be of some import. She doesn't suffer fools or time wasters. Tea? Or something stronger? No? Straight to business, then. I like that. Elias explained what he had found, laying out the facts as he knew them. The buried Pullman car, the torch cuts, the neatly stacked cans, the military footlocker. He told him about the sheriff's report and the subsequent land transfer. Alastair listened intently, his initial cheerfulness giving way to a deep, scholarly focus. He periodically stroked his chin, murmuring, "Fascinating. Utterly fascinating." When Elias finished, Alastair was silent for a full minute. He walked over to a tall filing cabinet and pulled out a rolled-up map.
He spread it across the drafting table. It was a geological survey map he had made himself in 1975. I remember this, he said, his finger tracing the area around the ravine. We were surveying for potential mineral deposits. I remember the locals talking about the old crash. The official story was always the flash flood, but it never sat right with me. He pointed to a series of notations on his map. The geology is wrong for a washout of that magnitude. It's stable granite. You'd need a 100-year storm, and there was no record of one that month. I always suspected the bridge failed for another reason, a structural flaw, or... He trailed off, looking at Elias. Or something else. Elias finished for him. Precisely. Sabotage, perhaps. But why? And why the cover-up? Your Pullman car is the key. He tapped the map. Now, Project Peregrine. That name rings a very distant bell. He scurried over to a bookshelf, groaning under the weight of government publications. He pulled down a thick, bound volume. A History of Cold War Infrastructure Projects in the Pacific Northwest. He flipped through the index. Peregrine. Ah, here it is. He read from the text, his voice hushed with excitement. Project Peregrine was a highly classified continuity of government initiative. The plan was to build a network of concealed, self-sufficient underground bunkers for essential scientific and administrative personnel in the event of a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Bunkers. Underground. Alistair continued. The project was headquartered out of Fairchild Air Force Base, but the proposed sites were deep in the wilderness of Idaho and Montana. The project was abruptly canceled in late 1957 due to unforeseen logistical and geological complications. The records were sealed. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The car, Elias said. It wasn't a passenger car. It was a mobile command post, a survey team. Exactly, Alistair exclaimed. They were out there to do the final site survey for a bunker. The train wasn't just carrying lumber. It was carrying the brain trust for Project Peregrine. The car was their office and their barracks. When the train went down, the government couldn't risk the Soviets finding out about the project or the location, so they buried it. The car, the equipment, the records, and the men. The neatly stacked cans, the folded blankets. They hadn't just survived. They had been trapped. They had lived in that buried steel tomb, waiting for a rescue that was never going to come. The government had not rescued them. It had entombed them. The torch cuts were their own desperate attempt to get out. I need to go back, Elias said, his voice hard. There's a footlocker in that car. The project records, Alistair breathed. The maps, the personnel files. The whole story. He looked at Elias, his academic excitement tempered by a new gravity. Mr. Thorne, you must understand what you have found. This is not just history. This is evidence of a profound injustice. Those men were not casualties of an accident. They were sacrificed. Elias was already heading for the door. The weight of this new knowledge was heavier than his own past. He had left one man behind to die on a ridge. But his country had left a whole team to die in a hole. And then erased their very existence. He had to open that footlocker. He had to give them back their names. If this chapter stirred something in you, if the thought of a buried truth waiting for a voice makes you pause, take a moment to support our journey. The world is full of forgotten stories and quiet duties waiting to be taken up. By liking, sharing, and leaving a comment,
You help us shine a light into those shadowed places.
Subscribe to our channel so we can continue to explore these tales of courage, loyalty, and the quiet miracles that can right old wrongs. Sometimes the Lord asks us to be the one who stops and listens to the silence. The hike back to the ravine felt different. The weight in his pack was the same, but the weight on his soul had grown. He was no longer just an exile hiding from his ghosts. He was now the custodian of other men's ghosts. He carried a crowbar and a set of bolt cutters, tools for an exhumation. Gage padded along beside him, sensing the change. The dog's usual calm watchfulness was replaced by a low-level, anxious energy. He knew they were returning to a place of deep wrongness. When they arrived at the site, Elias's blood ran cold. There were fresh tracks in the mud near the ravine's edge, 2 sets of them, heavy work boots, and the faint, geometric impression of a tripod. Someone else had been there, and recently. He left Gage at the top with the command to watch, and descended quickly, his movements fluid and silent. He approached the buried car with extreme caution. Nothing seemed disturbed. The makeshift ramp was still in place, but the air felt different. Watched. He slipped back inside the car, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the gloom. He went straight to the footlocker. It was still there, tucked under the table. He knelt and examined it again. And then he saw it. A tiny, fresh scratch on the brass of one of the latches. Someone had tried to pick the lock. His head snapped up, his senses screaming. He was not alone. He swept the beam of his light around the dark interior of the car. It caught a flicker of movement in the far corner. A man was crouched there, dressed in dark surveyor's gear. He was young, maybe 30, with the lean, hard look of a former soldier. He held a small, sophisticated-looking device in his hand, a portable scanner of some kind. The man raised his hands slowly, his face pale in the glare of the headlamp. "Easy," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not looking for trouble." "You're a little late for that," Elias said, his voice a low growl. He didn't move from his crouch, his body coiled like a spring. "Who are you?" "Name's Ben. I'm with a survey team." "There's nothing to survey here," Elias said. "This land is protected." "Not anymore," the man said. "The old easements expired. The land and the mineral rights were sold. We're doing a preliminary assessment for Viridian Rail Group. They bought up all the old P&W lines." Viridian Rail Group. The name sounded modern, corporate, sterile. "And your assessment includes breaking into a 60-year-old train car?" Elias asked, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Ben had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We detected a large metallic anomaly. My boss wanted to know what it was." He's thorough.
As if on cue, a new voice called down from the opening, smooth and confident. "Ben, have you found anything of interest?" Another man appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the gray light. He was older, in his late 40s, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen a speck of dirt. He was handsome, with a politician's easy smile, but his eyes were cold and appraising. He dropped into the car with surprising agility. "And who might this be?" the man asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. He looked at Elias's worn jacket and rugged appearance with faint disdain. "A local enthusiast, perhaps?" "He was here when I got here, Mr. Croft," Ben said. Croft, the boss. He ignored Ben and addressed Elias directly. "You're trespassing. This is private property now owned by my client. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." His tone was perfectly civil, the kind of polite dismissal that was more insulting than a direct threat.
"This is a gravesite," Elias said, his voice flat and hard.
Croft's smile tightened. It's a piece of industrial salvage, an unfortunate accident from a bygone era. My client is simply exercising their right to reclaim their property. He gestured at the footlocker, including any and all assets contained therein. These aren't assets, they're records, evidence, Elias countered. Croft let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. Evidence of what? A rusty train car? Let's not be dramatic. This is a simple matter of reclamation. We have the permits. We have the deeds. You have mud on your boots. He took a step closer. Whatever historical fantasy you've constructed in your head is irrelevant. Now I'll thank you to move aside. Elias didn't move. He stayed crouched by the footlocker, a silent, immovable obstacle. The two men faced each other in the dusty beam of the headlamp, a standoff between the past and the future, between memory and profit.
I'm not going to ask again, Croft said, his voice losing its silken edge, replaced by a thread of steel. Suddenly, from outside the car, a sound cut through the tension. It was a low, deep growl that vibrated through the metal hull of the car. It was not the sound of an angry dog. It was the sound of a controlled, lethal warning. Gage had judged the man and found him wanting. Croft froze. The color drained from his face. He was not afraid of Elias, the quiet man in the worn jacket. He was terrified of the unseen animal that made that sound. Ben, the younger man, took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide. He recognized that sound. It was the sound a military working dog makes just before it's given the command to attack. Elias slowly rose to his feet. I think my dog wants you to leave, he said, his voice quiet. He's very persuasive. Croft stared at Elias, his mask of civility shattered, revealing the raw avarice beneath. He glanced at the footlocker, then back at the dark opening. He made a calculation. He gave a curt nod. This isn't over, he hissed. He scrambled out of the car, with Ben following close behind. A moment later, Elias heard them crashing their way back up the side of the ravine. He was alone again in the darkness. But now he knew he was in a race. Croft would be back, and he would come with more than just a surveyor. He would come with equipment. He would come to tear this place apart and take what he wanted. Elias looked at the footlocker. He was out of time. He took out the crowbar. The old brass locks groaned in protest, then snapped with a sharp crack that echoed in the confined space. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old paper and dry ink filled the air. The contents were perfectly preserved, sealed away from the damp for 6 decades. On top was a leather-bound logbook. Elias lifted it out. The first page was a mission statement for Project Peregrine. The last entry was dated October 2nd, 1957, 3 weeks after the crash. The handwriting was neat, disciplined. Day 18. Rations low. Battery on the radio is dead. Peterson's leg is getting worse. No sign of rescue. We followed protocol. We destroyed the sensitive survey equipment, but I will not destroy the personnel files. These men deserve to have their names remembered. If this log is found, know that we served with honor. Captain John Miller, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Beneath the logbook were the files, a dozen of them, each one a man's life condensed onto a few pages. Name, rank, hometown. Elias picked one up at random. Sergeant Michael Shaw, demolitions expert. Hometown, Dayton, Ohio. He picked up another. Corporal David Chen, geologist. Hometown, San Francisco, California. He kept going, his hands moving with a reverent slowness.
He was giving them their names back, pulling them out of the darkness. And then he saw it. A name that made his breath catch in his throat.
A name that connected this cold, dark tomb directly to the hot, sun-baked ridge of his own failure. Specialist Robert Connolly, Communications. Hometown, Boston, Massachusetts. Connolly. It was the same last name as the young ranger he had been forced to leave behind in Afghanistan. The kid he had promised to get home. The kid whose face haunted his sleep. He fumbled with the file, his fingers suddenly clumsy. He opened it. Stapled to the inside was a small black and white photograph. A young man with a familiar lopsided grin and kind eyes. Underneath, a handwritten note. My grandfather. The reason I joined. Elias stared at the photo. It was the same grin. The same eyes. The man in this file, Specialist Robert Connolly, was the grandfather of the man he had lost. The kid had been following in the footsteps of a ghost, a grandfather who had simply vanished from family history in 1957. He hadn't vanished. He was here. He had died here, in this cold steel box, waiting for a rescue that never came. The weight of it all crashed down on Elias. This was not just about justice for strangers anymore. This was atonement. He had failed the grandson. He would not fail the grandfather. He carefully packed the logbook and the personnel files into his backpack. He would not let Croft get his hands on these. He would not let these men's stories be erased for a second time. As he climbed out of the car, the sky above had turned a bruised, angry purple. A storm was coming. The storm broke just after dusk, a furious assault of wind and rain that turned the forest into a thrashing, roaring chaos. Elias sat in his small, Spartan cabin, a single lamp casting a pool of golden light on the table. The logbook and the files were laid out before him, a sacred trust. He had read every one of them. He knew their names, their ages, their hometowns. He knew Captain Miller had a daughter named Sarah. He knew Sergeant Shaw was a fan of the Cleveland Indians. They were no longer ghosts. They were men. Gage lay by the hearth where a low fire crackled, but he was not asleep. His head was up, his ears twitching, listening to the fury of the storm. But he was listening for something else, too. They both were. They were waiting for Croft. The sound came around midnight, a low, grinding rumble that was not thunder. It was the sound of heavy machinery. Elias went to the window and peered out into the rain-swept darkness. Far down the logging road that led towards the ravine, he saw the sweep of headlights. 2, 3 sets of them. A heavy-duty flatbed truck carrying a small bulldozer and 2 other work trucks. Croft had returned, using the cover of the storm to mask his movements. Elias felt a cold rage settle over him. Croft wasn't just going to take the car. He was going to destroy the site, rip it apart with the bulldozer, and obliterate any evidence that didn't have a price tag. He was going to desecrate that grave for profit. Elias moved quickly. He put the files and the logbook into a waterproof bag and stowed them safely. He pulled on his wet weather gear, his movements precise and economical. He checked his headlamp, his knife, a length of climbing rope in his pack. He was not going to fight them. He couldn't. But he had to bear witness. He had to do something to stop them. He had made one call before the storm hit, to Martha Riley at her home. He had told her everything. She had been silent for a moment, then said, "I'll call the State Historical Preservation Office and the sheriff. But it will take time for them to get up there, especially in this weather. You're on your own until morning." Until morning. He looked at Gage. "Let's go, boy. We're buying time." They moved through the storm-lashed woods like specters, the wind tearing at them,
the rain plastering their hair to their heads.
The noise of the machinery grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat of destruction. When they reached the ravine, the scene was a nightmare of light and shadow. Croft's crew had set up powerful work lights, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the site. The bulldozer was already on the old railway bed, its engine idling, its steel blade gleaming in the rain. Croft stood under a large umbrella, directing two men who were setting up a heavy-duty winch system anchored to the base of a massive pine tree. Ben, the young surveyor, was with them, his face grim, his movements reluctant. They were going to haul the whole car up the side of the ravine. Elias and Gage found cover in a thicket of firs about 30 yards away, hidden in the deep shadows outside the ring of light. They could only watch. He had the evidence. The story was safe. But his gut twisted at the thought of them tearing that car from its resting place. It felt like a violation. The winch cable was attached to the exposed end of the Pullman car. Croft gave a signal. The winch motor roared to life, and the cable went taut. The car groaned, a sound of tortured metal. It shifted in its earthy tomb, scraping against rock. And then a section of the ravine wall above it, destabilized by the rain and the vibration, gave way. A cascade of mud and rock slid down, not a massive landslide, but enough. It slammed into the side of the car, causing it to lurch violently. At the same moment, a section of the bridge wreckage from further down the ravine, loosened by the slide, broke free. A 10-foot length of rusted iron truss tumbled down the slope and crashed into the ground near the car, dislodging more earth and rock. It all happened in a split second. Elias saw Gage tense, a low growl in his throat. The dog had been focused on the men, but now his attention was on the unstable ground. He saw the danger before Elias did. A new fissure had opened up in the ground near the base of the car, and a large slab of granite, half buried for 60 years, was shifting. Gage broke cover. He bolted towards the car, barking furiously. He wasn't attacking. He was warning. He was trying to draw attention to the new instability. Elias shouted his name, but the dog was operating on pure instinct. He ran to the shifting slab, barking at the ground as if to command it to stop. And then the slab gave way completely. It didn't fall far, just a few feet, settling into the new fissure with a sickening crunch. And Gage, who had been right beside it, yelped, a sharp cry of pain that cut through the storm. His back leg was pinned. The massive slab of granite had trapped him. Elias's world narrowed to that single, piercing cry. He broke from the trees, running into the harsh glare of the work lights. Croft and his men stared at him, stunned. Elias didn't even see them. He only saw Gage, struggling, his leg caught under the edge of the stone.
Croft recovered first.
"Get him out of here," he yelled to his men, "and keep that winch running."
Elias reached the dog. Gage was whining now, his eyes wild with pain. But when he saw Elias, he stopped struggling. He trusted him. Elias ran his hands over the dog's trapped leg. It was caught fast. The slab was immense, tons of solid rock. He couldn't move it alone. And then the memory hit him, not as a whisper, but as a roar. The Hindu Kush. The ranger, Connolly, pinned down by enemy fire, his leg shattered. The radio crackling with the order to pull back. The mission was compromised. Leave him. Elias had looked at the kid, had seen the plea in his eyes, and he had given the order. He had chosen the mission. He had left him. He looked from Gage, trapped and helpless, to Croft, who was screaming at his men to ignore them and focus on the car. The winch was still straining, pulling the Pullman from its grave.
Inside that car was the final piece of the story, the physical tomb itself. His mission was to protect it, to stop Croft from desecrating it before the authorities arrived. He had the files. He had the logbook. The story would be told. but the sight itself. He looked into Gage's eyes, the same trust, the same plea. Don't leave me. In that instant, the 60 years of buried history, the weight of Project Peregrine, the rage at Croft, it all fell away. There was only the dog, his partner, his anchor. He had made the correct choice once before, and it had cost him his soul. He would not make it again. "Shut it down!" Elias roared, his voice carrying over the storm, a command born of absolute authority. "Shut the winch down, now!" Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're in no position to give orders. Get out of the way or my men will move you." Elias ignored him. He turned his back on the winch, on the car, on the mission. He knelt beside Gage, shielding the dog's body with his own. He put his hands on the massive slab of granite. It was useless, he knew, but he had to try. He was staying. Whatever happened, he was staying. This was his corrective action, his penance. He looked across at Croft's men, at Ben. Their eyes met over the chaos. Elias saw the conflict in the young surveyor's face, the conflict between a paycheck and a code. Ben was a soldier. He recognized what was happening. He saw a man choosing his brother-in-arms over everything else. Croft screamed at his winch operator. "I said keep it running!" Ben moved. He stumbled near the winch's hydraulic lines, his heavy boot catching on a coupling. There was a hiss of escaping fluid, and the winch motor screamed and then seized. The cable went slack. The Pullman car, halfway out of the ground, settled back with a deep groan. Silence, except for the wind and the rain. "What have you done, you idiot?" Croft shrieked at Ben. Ben just looked at Elias and gave a barely perceptible nod. The standoff was broken by a new sound. The wail of a siren, faint at first, then growing steadily closer. Martha Riley had come through. The flashing red and blue lights painted the trees at the edge of the logging road. The cavalry had arrived. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. His window of opportunity had slammed shut. He was trapped between a man who would not break, a dog who would not yield, and the approaching law. The game was over. Elias stayed where he was, his hand resting on Gage's head, whispering quiet reassurances. He had made his choice. He had stayed. And in the middle of the storm, in the heart of the chaos, for the first time in years, Elias Thorne felt a profound sense of peace. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The sky was washed clean, a pale, fragile blue. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth. The ravine was no longer a scene of desecration, but a protected site. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire area. 2 county sheriff's vehicles were parked on the railway bed, and a team of people in jackets marked State Historical Society were moving about with quiet, reverent purpose. Julian Croft was there, stripped of his authority and his umbrella. He was leaning against a sheriff's car, his expensive gear stained with mud, talking to a grim-faced deputy. His polite mask was gone, replaced by a sullen, impotent anger. Ben, the young surveyor, was talking to another deputy, giving a statement. He met Elias's eye and gave a small, respectful nod before getting into the back of the patrol car to be driven back to town. He was a witness, not a suspect. Elias sat on the tailgate of his own pickup, sipping hot coffee from a thermos. Beside him, Gage lay on a thick wool blanket, his bandaged back leg resting carefully. The vet in town, roused from his sleep by a frantic call from Martha Riley, had confirmed it was a bad break, but clean. He would heal. He would walk again. He would run again. Gage whined softly and nudged Elias's hand, his tail giving a weak thump against the tailgate. "I know, boy. Elias murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. You did good. A car he didn't recognize pulled up the road. It was a modest sedan, out of place among the official vehicles and battered pickup trucks. A woman got out. She was younger than him, with the same dark hair and a face etched with a familiar worry. It was his sister, Clara. He hadn't seen her in 2 years. He had called her from the vet's office in the small hours of the morning while Gage was being x-rayed. He hadn't known what to say. He had just started talking. About the car, about the files, about the name Connolly. He had told her the whole story. When he finished, there had been a long silence on the line. Then she had just said, "Where are you? I'm coming." She walked over to him now, her eyes taking in the scene, the dog, the exhaustion on his face. She didn't hug him. They weren't a family for big gestures. She just stood there for a moment, then reached out and touched the bandage on Gage's leg. "He's going to be okay?" "He'll be okay," Elias confirmed. "And you?" she asked, her gaze finally meeting his. It was a question that carried the weight of years of unanswered calls and worried nights. Elias looked out at the ravine, where the historians were carefully documenting the Pullman car, its story now safe. He thought of the choice he had made in the storm, the simple act of staying. It had not erased the past. It had not brought back the young ranger from that ridge in Afghanistan. But it had balanced a scale inside him that had been tipped for far too long. He had finally chosen the man, the dog, over the mission. "I'm getting there," he said. And for the first time, he believed it. He saw his own reflection in the truck's side mirror, a tired man, his face grimy, his jacket torn. And he didn't look away. Later that day, a representative from the Army came. A quiet, serious colonel who listened to the whole story and reviewed the logbook with a somber expression. He promised a full investigation and a formal recognition for the men of Project Peregrine. Their names would be cleared, their families would be notified, a memorial would be placed. The secret was finally out, not as a scandal, but as a long overdue honor. The state offered Elias a position, a temporary one at first, site custodian. They needed someone to stay on the land, to watch over the place while the careful work of recovery and preservation was underway. Someone who knew the terrain and respected the history. Someone who had already proven his loyalty to it. He accepted. The idea of leaving now felt wrong. He had come to this place to hide, but he had found a reason to stay. He had a new duty. Weeks later, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the pines with white. Elias stood on the edge of the ravine, Gage at his side. The dog's limp was almost gone. A simple, dignified granite marker had been erected on the railway bed. It listed the names of the 12 men who had been lost there. The last name on the list was Specialist Robert Connolly. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, the one of the young ranger, Connolly's grandson, that had been sent to him with the boy's effects. He had carried it with him for years, another piece of his penance. He looked from the smiling face in the photo to the name carved in the stone. He had brought them together, in a way. He had closed a circle. He looked out at the vast, quiet wilderness. The mountains no longer felt like a place of exile. They felt like home. The silence was no longer a void to swallow his memories, but a peaceful space in which to hold them. He had not outrun his past. He had finally made peace with it, right here, in this place of buried truths and second chances. Gage leaned against his leg, a solid, living presence. The ticking of the watch on his wrist was no longer an accusation. It was just the sound of time moving forward.
and for Elias Thorne, that was enough. What we have just witnessed is more than the story of a man and his dog, more than a forgotten piece of history brought to light. It is a testament to the quiet miracles that unfold when we have the courage to stop, to listen, and to answer a call that was not meant for us. Elias came to the mountains seeking to lose himself, but God, in his infinite and often mysterious wisdom, gave him a task that would help him find himself again. He was given a chance to right a wrong that was not his, and in doing so, he found a path to heal his own broken past. His story is a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds are often healed not by forgetting, but by service.
His redemption did not come in a grand battle, but in a quiet choice made in a storm. The choice to value loyalty over purpose, to protect the one being who had stood by him in his own darkness. He chose to stay. So often in our lives, we are told to move on, to push forward, to leave the past behind. But sometimes, the most profound act of faith and healing is simply to stay. To stand your ground for what is right, to guard a memory, to honor a promise, to protect the helpless. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, a past failure, a past choice that haunts your quiet moments, know this: you are not alone. Your second chance may not look like a buried train car in the wilderness. It may be a small opportunity to show kindness, to speak a truth, to keep a promise you thought was long forgotten. These are God's works, happening in ordinary moments. Look for them. Be ready for them. The strength to stay, the courage to choose loyalty, the grace to accept a second chance. These are the gifts we are offered every day. May God bless you and keep you. May He give you the strength to face your own storms and the wisdom to know when it is time to simply stay. Please share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Comment with your own stories of loyalty and quiet courage, and subscribe so that we may continue to walk these paths of faith together.